All right, I guess we're ready to launch into it. I'm here with Jane Steinmetz of Ernst & Young, or EY as they like to be called now. Mm-hmm. I don't know, when was the big...
when it came vogue to go to acronyms.
The big change. Well, as you know, Ernst & Young / EY is one of the biggest accounting and consulting firms in the country, if not the world. And we're going to talk about specifically diversity and inclusion and unconscious bias, and what Jane and everyone at EY does with regard to this topic, and in particular, how they've handled it, and maybe some recommendations that you can take home to your businesses and your industries. First, Jane, I was hoping maybe you could just talk a little bit more about yourself, how diversity and inclusion fits in with EY and why it's so important.
Great. Okay, so as mentioned, I'm the managing partner of the Boston office of EY, and here we have about 2,300 employees spanning all different disciplines. And I started a long time ago in my career. 93 is when I got out of law school, so just to my journey. But in terms of diversity and inclusion, so I guess the way I think about it is, first level setting on what is, oh sure, let me just make sure. Can you hear me now? Much better. So diversity, let's just level set in terms of when we talk about diversity, what are we actually talking about? Because I know we jump to gender and we jump to race, but diversity is really any difference. It could be your hometown, it could be your alma mater, it could be your thinking style, leadership style. And so at EY, what we focus on is we do not want our folks to somehow gravitate towards what's familiar to them. And it might be something that is, physical appearance difference, but it might be something under the surface, like, oh, we're both from the same hometown, and then you disproportionately sponsor that person because you have that familiarity. Or, gee, isn't it funny, everyone from my group graduated from BC, how did that happen? So we look at diversity and we say, you know what, we want you to think about diversity holistically, and we want you to embrace diversity. So that's the first. Inclusion, as is the way we say, how do you activate diversity? Because with diversity, there's diversity of thought. There's so many benefits you get out of diversity, so you really want to activate that. That's the inclusion part. But what we're really gravitating towards, and what we're really super focused on, is creating this sense of belonging. It's one thing to strive for a diverse workforce, but do they feel like they belong? So we're trying to get to this point where everyone understands that we are embracing and welcoming diversity so that they have that sense of belonging, because we think that's when you really activate the best out of employees.
Well, I can tell you, when you first got into the field, the leadership of the various large accounting firms was not quite so diverse.
Yeah. No,
it's changed a bit, as evidenced by the fact that you're now running the Boston office. Tell me a little bit about how it's changed, both in terms of when you got started in what was considered largely a man's field, mm-hmm. and how it changed as you were sort of moving up the ranks.
Yeah, sure. What's funny is it has been considered a male-dominated profession historically, and I think it's because of the leadership ranks. But for the last 25 years or so, the entry level coming into, let's just focus on accounting, because I know those statistics, into the accounting profession was 50-50 men, women. So, 25 years, 50-50, equal percentage of men and women starting, yet when you got to the leadership positions, it wasn't like that. And so if I was to digress to what it was like when I started versus what it's like now, I just remember, it wasn't that long ago, I had my first child, and it was the basics that were not in the system. It was like, I wanted to work from home one day a week. I remember back in the day, someone said, working from home was beginning to catch on wasn't that long ago, but this one person that I reported to said, no way, can't work from home. We do not work from home. And I was a partner at that point, and I just remember thinking, you know what? I know I bring a lot to the table. And so I remember, and I did have this kind of rapport with this individual, but I remember saying to the person, you know what? Then you can fire me, because I'm working from home. Like, that's it, you know? But you had to break that, you know, ice in the group to just work from home. I mean,
you weren't actually fired.
I was not.
That's an important point.
I was not. And this individual ended up loving working from home once he, you know. So it was the basics that were not there. And then there was more substantive, I would say issues that were just harder to grasp. Like working from home, you just start working from home. But as you were mentioning, you would look above and say, no one looks like me. No one operates like me. How am I supposed to get to the next level if my qualities do not seem to be, you know, what matter? And there were some at the time women leaders, but I will say, if you go really, you know, back in time, a lot of the women leaders at then, and God bless them, they were trailblazers, but they learned how to operate like men. And so they weren't role models to me. They didn't, you know, they were just learned how to operate like men. So that, I think it's changed a lot. You know, I think we're heading in the right direction, still have more work to do, but we've got the basics down, and we're seeing more diversity in the leadership ranks and a lot more focus on it, which is great.
So talk a little bit more about exactly how your firm and how the industry in general is focusing on it. How is that, you know, what are some of the tangible things that accounting and consulting firms are doing?
Sure. So a couple of things. We mentioned at the beginning unconscious bias or implicit bias, and there's a real recognition that the tone has to be set at the top. You know, stop. Tone has to be set at the top. So you have to have leaders who understand that their actions are setting the tone. So they need to think diversely. They need to think about a diverse slate of leadership. They need to equitably sponsor team members. But that's not enough. And so one of the things that we're very focused on, I think the next step in the journey, it's one thing is focus on senior leadership. And we have global diversity councils and America's diversity councils. We take people off site, and all we do is talk about at the highest levels our culture and our journey in D&I, and that does set a tone. But what you find is you spend a lot of time trying to hire a diverse workforce, and then 2-3 years later, some of our diverse professionals are leaving. And when that happens, a lot of it, not a lot, I don't want to say all of it, but usually when you hear on an exit interview is it's their immediate team. It's their immediate supervisor. So you need to have that unconscious bias training or implicit bias training at all levels. People need to understand that it's not this person or that person that has this bias, it's everybody. And so we're having mandated unconscious bias training to try to get people to understand it doesn't mean you're a bad person, but we all have these biases, and you have to learn to identify when you're exercising them and not being inclusive. So broad-based unconscious bias is one of the things that training is one of the things that we're really focused on.
I mean, almost every business person I talk to says diversity is important to their company. Why is it important to yours? I mean, aside from being the right thing to do, what is the business case for diversity from your perspective?
Sure. So I guess I'd say it's 3 things. One, you know, it's just the right thing to do. I mean, we can't mistreat people. We can't have somebody in our offices not feeling like they belong. That's just like terrible. So it's the right thing to do. But from a business perspective, most all companies, I would say all of them, I know definitely in a professional services firm, our asset is people. You know, that's our biggest asset. That's what we sell. We sell people's time, right? So you want to make sure you are grabbing the best talent from the pool of talent that's out there. So my example about, back in the day, it was 50% women and men coming in to the accounting profession, but then, let's say, I don't know what the numbers were, but it was not 50-50 at the leadership rank. We missed out on talent because the talent was there. So we want to make sure we're pulling talent into the firm from all pools of talents, all different groups, and then cultivating that talent up through all the ranks. But then I would say the third thing is it's a business imperative, because when you have a monotone team, that monotone team is going to come up with solutions that probably are missing some things. They probably have some blind spots if everyone's kind of from the same background, thinking the same way. So we wouldn't be coming out with the best answers if we allow those blind spots to persist. And you're typically solving problems for a diverse pool. So if you're in retail, your customers are diverse. If you're in healthcare, your patients are diverse. So your teams should be reflective of the communities you serve, and kind of getting that diversity of thought through the system.
So you mentioned one way at diversity is unconscious bias training. Mm-hmm. I'm sure some of the people in the room are familiar with it or have gone through it, but I was wondering if you could explain a little bit about what it's like. How do you find the right, I assume you have outside people that come in. How does that process work? And then what, people go off site, or is it done, as part of the workday?
Sure. So within EY, we have all different types of groups. One group is a group that focuses on people advisory services and diversity and inclusion. So we do have a lot of talent in-house that helps us along with this, but we're always a sponge for best practices, and we do tons and tons of studies, both internally across our employee base and in countries of, offices across countries, as well as with our public data. But I would say the unconscious bias training, we do it in our offices, we mandate it. And what's great about it is it really has some thoughtful segments in terms of the types of unconscious bias that can persist. And it will get to race and gender, but it will really challenge people to think about their biases. So for example, if, some of the examples we'll raise is, so you're interviewing someone, and you're interviewing a bunch of people, and then all of a sudden someone comes in and they say, hey, I notice you're from Rhode Island, and I'm from Rhode Island, right? So all of a sudden I disproportionately start talking to this person. So you're from Rhode Island, so what town? Oh my God, that's my town. Oh, do you know this person? Do you know that person? You start
Odds are good if it's Rhode Island, they do.
They do, right? You're probably related, right? So then you would this person gets hired, you see him in the office, you say, hey, let's catch lunch. And then before you know it, that lunch is turning into oh, how's your workday going? Oh, you're on that client. I should connect you to this other person who worked on that client. They start to get sponsorship. Start to get sponsorship because of that thread of familiarity between these two people. And if we allow that to happen to the disadvantage of other people, that's just not right. And so what you can find sometimes is that people who are not maybe in the majority are not getting that sponsorship that someone else is, and then it's just like, oh my God, we have this performance differential. And I would challenge, is it really a performance differential, or was it disproportionate mentorship between two groups? Like, we really have to challenge ourselves. So we have all of these examples where people look at them like, oh, I might have done that. I might have been in one of those interview settings. It really challenges people's biases. So you can identify it and act and learn when you're doing it and stop it. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned mentorship, and I think that is like a key part of diversity and inclusion that is where maybe diversity doesn't happen not in a malevolent way, but it sort of subtly just sets the stage for a continuing of the same type of people, the same type of thought at the top.
Yep.
How do you see that playing out in your firm, and how do you think that mentorship approach has changed since, over the last couple decades?
So I'll tell a story. I'll give you 3 renditions of where we've been, where I think most companies are now, and where we need to go. So real quickly, just storytelling time. So let's assume Dan. Dan oversees 500 people. Everybody loves Dan. He's awesome. It gets announced Dan's going to get another position, and higher position, everyone's thrilled for Dan. And they say, well, now the hubbub is, who's going to take over Dan's role? And they say, well, of course, everyone's thinking it's going to be Eric. Eric's been Dan's right hand since 10 years ago when Eric got the job. When Dan got the job. And Eric's proved himself. The 500 employees love Eric. Eric handles everything, large jobs, oversees large groups of people within that group. People want it to be Eric. So back in the day, Eric got the job, right? Nowadays, if Dan went to his superiors and said, I think it should be Eric, nowadays I think people would say, no. You need a diverse slate of candidates. Go back, do some homework, you need a diverse slate of candidates. So then Dan would go back and say, well, I have Eric. What about Mary? I've heard good things about Mary. And what about Manish? He's been in our group. And then Mary and Manish are tapped. You might be in the running for this job. And they're all jazzed up about it. They're thinking about it. Wow, that's great. And what comes out is, Mary didn't oversee enough large projects. And Manish didn't have enough experience overseeing groups of people. So they go back, and 2 things happen nowadays. Either Eric still gets it, because he's tried and true, or they do what they call like a flyer, a best athlete, and maybe Mary gets it. There's nothing wrong with either one, because maybe Mary is worthy, she just hasn't had the opportunities. But where I'm hoping we gravitate towards is when Dan, in my example, got the job 10 years ago, within a year, he was accountable for coming up with a diverse slate of potential successors, who he is now accountable to equitably sponsor throughout his tenure, not just Eric, but the Marys and the Manishes and others, to see who actually is best for his role. Maybe it would have been Mary, maybe it was Manish, maybe it was somebody else. But I think we need to dial back our mentoring and our sponsorship in advance of leadership changes, so that we make, we give everyone equal opportunities to prove themselves and develop the skills that, they'll need for that role.
So do you see that already happening at EY, in Boston and elsewhere?
Yeah, I would say it's happening. I'd like to see it happen more. And I would say we're somewhere in between the 2. And so I think I'm going on an offsite next week, and this is going to be a huge topic about how can we equitably sponsor well in advance. And so we do have programs like this, and I would just say companies are in different spectrums of their journey. I'd say EY has been at this for a while. I'm proud of where we are. I think we all have work to do, but some companies are here, some companies are here, and you just got to keep moving along in that journey.
So any other tips you can provide for other employers about dealing with the issue?
Yeah, I would say the best thing that we can do is to go back to the office and talk to someone you usually don't talk to. Just widen your group. Just talk to people that you don't usually sponsor and mentor and interact with. Look for people that you can find out about and embrace their differences. We can do it in small ways, just like that.
That seems actually pretty easy.
Yep.
Yeah, we can all do that. We don't need to have
a big program.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah, exactly.
Or hire outside consultants to figure that out.
That's what I would say.
Well, great. I'm now up against the time. I only have 14 seconds left up here, so I think we'll wrap things up. If you could give Jane a round of applause for all her insight, that'd be great.